Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we discuss research-backed strategies and techniques with recognized thought leaders that will deliver results that matter and create lasting change for leaders at all levels. Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Today, I'm glad to be joined by Dr. David Burkus, which is one of the world's leading business thinkers. Has forward-thinking ideas and a best-selling author that helps leaders build their best team ever. He is also the best-selling author of 5 books about business and leadership. His books have won multiple awards and been translated into dozens of languages. He's also shared his insights on leadership and teamwork on the Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, USA Today, Financial Times, and many others. Last but certainly not least, he's also a former business school professor who now works with organizations across all industries. And his best-selling book, his newest book, is Best Team Ever, which is going to be the topic and focus of this episode. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Oh, thank you for having me. Hey, you missed IMS faculty, by the way. You
There
missed
you
out.
go.
Proud IMS faculty member. There you go.
Wonderful. Love to hear that as well. And looking forward to your next program with us. So this new book, Best Team Ever, kind of plays upon your previous work. But what got you inspired really to write this book at this time?
Yeah. So a couple things happen at once. I mean, the through line through all of my work has been teams. I'm an organizational psychologist, so I study workplace behavior, and that means I study how teams interact. Right. Um, Even my very first book 10 years ago, one of the whole chapters on that was dedicated to the idea that creativity and innovation is a team sport, right? And how, so it's been the through line throughout all of it. I think the big kind of why now is the broader question. One of the realizations I had kind of during the pandemic. So everybody who could work from home was sent to work from home. We all got the Zoom fatigue. I released a book called Leading from Anywhere that was about sort of, you didn't ask to lead a remote team, but how do you do it? How do you navigate hybrid teams and all of that sort of stuff? But one of the things in working for like 2.5, almost 3 years with people as they figured out their remote, figured out their return to the office or hybrid strategy was that the team that people were serving on suddenly became the most important factor in their engagement, their motivation, their performance, right? And I think, by the way, I think this was always true, but in the early 2000s, even into the early 2000 teens, we became obsessed with company culture and started to define it as, perks, free food in the break rooms, free lunch, right? Or kombucha on tap, or these crazy kind of get everybody together meetings and events and retreats, and we associated it with the entire company and company wide initiatives. But like I said, I don't know that that's ever been true. If I ask most people to describe what it's like to work at the company they work for, they spend a whole lot more time telling me what it's like to work for their specific boss, their specific teams that they're on, et cetera. So the team is kind of central to our experience of work and whether or not we perform. And then there was the factor that we're in different types of teams than we've ever been before. Even if you're back to the office, even if you never left, a good 50 or 60% of the American workforce never actually worked remotely. But even now, you're still virtually collaborating with people who maybe inside of your company, maybe it's a vendor, supplier, what have you. But the definition of a team has expanded beyond just people who report to my boss. And so that caused me to kind of have a post pandemic rethinking of what do we need to know about the research behind what explains whether or not teams are high performing, and then what can we do to do that. And it turns into really, it kind of comes down to culture and kind of 3 big elements of a team's culture that kind of make or break the success of that team.
That's great. And we're going to get into those 3 elements here shortly. But I love the statement in the book that talent doesn't make the team makes the talent. And that's kind of counterintuitive because for many individuals, they feel like if you have better individuals, more intelligent, smarter individuals that can perform at a higher level, that team, when they put them together, that team is going to be more productive.
Yeah, well, so did the people at Google when they when they conducted Project Aristotle to try and figure out what made for the best team, right? If you talk to the people that ran that study, massive study, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of data points across the whole company too, not just, US based, but internationally. And they thought it was going to be a formula, right? Like you need this percentage of introverts and this percentage of extroverts, and you need this many STEM people and this many artistic and blah, blah, blah. And if you do that, you'll build the perfect team. And it turned out none of those things correlated to the success or failure of the team. What it came down to were the norms, the habits of behavior, the way people interacted on a team. whether or not they had kind of a sense of each other's and had empathy for each other, or whether or not they had a sense of psychological safety. All of these things are cultural things. They're not skills or abilities things. And you can't recruit your way out of a crappy team culture. You can't. And even if you could, unfortunately, at least my experience, and it's anecdotal, but I bet it matches yours and everyone who's listening to this, a lot of times those really talented people are also not exactly non-toxic. I won't say they're toxic to a team culture, but they're not exactly healing to a team culture. They want to be those stars a lot of times. And so that, we've all had experiences of this, attempting to recruit that star player and not having it work out, because you can't recruit your way out of a bad culture. What you can do is work to change the culture of the team you have now, and you'd be amazed who might turn into a star.
And as a result, talent doesn't make the team. So great statement there. A lot of insight into that. Completely agree with that statement. Let's move into those three elements, right? You have three elements that you say that are characteristics of high performing teams. These three elements provide teams with a common set of norms and behaviors that kind of guide them through collaborating with one another and improving their performance. Let's start with the first one, a common understanding. What is that about?
Yeah, yeah, and all of the other, by the way, like nerdy people, org psych people like me who might be listening to this are going, "How did he get to 3? There's 5. There's a lot of lists. There's a lot." And this is really my attempt. Like 3 is the max of what I think a busy manager can actually remember, right? So, in common understanding, we draw from a bunch of different areas of research. But fundamentally, if I give you one sentence definition, it's how well team members have a commonly held perspective on each other's expertise, assigned tasks, but also context and preferences. So roles and responsibilities, but also strengths and weaknesses and preferences. And this ties into a lot of sort of Martine Haas and Mark Mortenson's work on shared understanding, or Anita Williams Woolley's work on collective intelligence. It's not just about knowing, hey, this is what the team expects from me, and this is what I'm going to get from the team, and here's the deadlines, and we have the charts and the KPIs all straight. That's great. That's what we call clarity. But there's also an empathy side where I understand that so and so prefers to do meetings on without a camera on, or so and so prefers to think through in writing. So I need to kind of accommodate that. And this person's strengths are over here, and this person has this going on in their life. That I call the empathy side, right? That we understand those different contexts and preferences. And those are what really make the difference in whether or not we can collaborate well. Because it's great to have clarity and to know what's expected of you and trust that other people are going to deliver it, but you're going to need help. And when you need help, you're going to need to understand the person that you're going to ask for help. Or when you're giving that help, you're going to need to understand the person that you're giving help to. And that only comes from empathy. So common understanding is really that combination of not only clarity of roles, but empathy, clarity of people as well.
Those are great insights, and we'll get into clarity and empathy here in a second. I just wanted to return back to what you said about Woolley's work and how it's really the collective intelligence. It's not the average intelligence of a group that predicts the results, correct?
Yeah, this is fascinating to me, right? So Anita Williams Woolley and in true Anita Williams Woolley form, a host of different collaborators, depending on the study and the paper, right? They coined this term collective intelligence. What she essentially found was that if you looked at the general intelligence, the IQ of individual people, and then you looked and gave all of these different teams that you randomly assigned tasks, two really weird things. Number one, you couldn't just like take the average IQ of all the different people and predict anything. So there wasn't like a average intelligence. I mean, there was, because there's a raw average, but it didn't predict anything. And then the second is that the people who performed well in one task, let's say a highly creative task, also performed well in a highly analytical task or a highly logical task. And the reason was what she called, they tapped into a collective intelligence, an intelligence that actually exceeded the average IQ of the individuals, because they were able to get everyone's perspectives out. They were able to actually tap into the knowledge behind each team. Now, the interesting thing then is what predicts collective intelligence. And this is where the research gets really fun. The number one thing, and they don't often share this, but I'll let you in on the secret. The number one thing that actually predicted the success or failure of these teams in her research was the percentage of women on the team. Like,
Wow.
so, if you take away nothing else from the podcast, like, yeah, we need to hire more women onto this team. Now, there's an explanation for that, which is, and obviously genders overlap and what have you in terms of abilities and skills. But in general, women tend to score higher on what's called social sensitivity. They tend to allow for more conversational turn taking. They tend to be able to read the emotions behind someone's words better. And all of that builds into that empathy piece we were talking about, and is what allows people to have collective intelligence. So if you got like way too many men or a room full of men in your team, doesn't matter. There's still hope for you. You just need to develop social sensitivity. It just so happens that one gender is better than the other at developing this sense of social sensitivity.
That's a great insight to hear. And surprised me as well. So
Yeah, it's bad. I mean, we say this as two white dudes too, right? It's bad news for us. But the good news is you can train this, you can develop it,
now that we know better, we should do better, right?
right?
Getting into role clarity, I love the story that you shared in the book about Fred Barger and his training approach and how that led to greater role clarity.
Yeah. So if you live in a very specific part of kind of Appalachia, Southern Appalachia, like Eastern Tennessee, and then into that area, you may have been to a Powell's Sudden Service, which is a fast food chain, mostly drive-through fast food chain that is honestly per square footage and per customer reviews and what have you, the most successful fast food chain in the world. Powell's is actually the first and the only fast food, but the first restaurant to have won a Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award for the quality of their service. Their error rate in terms of what you order being what you get is something like 1 in 3,600. Right
Wow.
now, McDonald's, for comparison, is like 1 in 300, and honestly, for me, it feels like 1 in 2. But that's a whole other monologue, right? And the reason they do this is they're committed to this clarity side, right? So if you're thinking about, you're just working in a drive-through restaurant, but before you set foot in that restaurant, you've actually received 80 hours of training ahead of time, right? So think about 2 weeks if you're thinking about a full time job, more because most of their people are part time. You've received that much training ahead of time. There's 8 different stations inside of the drive through store, and you're usually trained on 2 or 3 of them. As you get into more management roles, you're trained on all of them because you can't manage what you don't know, right? And then to reinforce the oh, and the other thing I think is really interesting is usually from day to day, in order to keep your knowledge fresh on all of them, it's not like you're great at this station, so we're going to keep putting you on this station. You kind of get randomized based on who else is on the team and what have you, and what role you're going to be at. So you always have to be on your toes. You don't know till you show up for your shift what your job is actually going to be. You may also get the pop quiz. So at a regular basis, they get team members. They start their shift and they're given a pop quiz, which is just process knowledge. How do you do this? How many squirts of ketchup go on this burger? And all of these different questions. And what I love about the pop quiz, by the way, cheating is encouraged. In other words, if you don't know the answer, go find someone else on the team who can help you get that answer, because that's just as valuable to your learning as anything. It's not about the score, it's about
That collaborative team culture, right? Right.
Exactly, exactly. Now, my absolute favorite thing about the way they work this is that everybody's so committed to clarity and so committed to this training and continuous development that every leader at every level has to spend 10% of their time, including the CEO, has to spend 10% of their time developing or giving training or developing employees in some capacity. So you never earn your way out of a training role. You are always seeking to pour into whoever's kind of underneath you. And what that does, you might think that actually degrades people. You might think it actually makes people feel like cogs in a finely tuned machine. But the truth is, it actually increases engagement because people know exactly what's expected of them. They have confidence that they can deliver on what's expected of them. And they have trust that the other people on the line, the other people working in that restaurant, are also going to perform at that level. And that's something that's really, really hard to replicate. It's one of the reasons their error rate is so low. Their revenue per square foot is so high. My favorite, by the way, my favorite stat about them is your perfect order between order and when you drive away from the window, your perfect order will be delivered in about 19 seconds. That's faster than it takes to sing happy birthday.
What an incredible story. I'm just sad that I only read about it in your book. I mean, that should be a model for other companies with their training program and just their mindset and their philosophy. I know that that popular movie with McDonald's, the founder kind of showed their process with the quickie system and whatnot. But yeah, this just kind of blows that out of the water.
Yeah, no, exactly, exactly. Like we think about standardization and what have you when we think about franchise businesses, but PAL, first of all, isn't franchised. It's completely privately owned, but it takes that systemization to another level. And again, you might think that actually demotivates people, but it doesn't because of that collaborative nature, right? Cheating on pop quizzes encouraged, and also the idea that your bosses, your managers are not just telling you you're doing a bad job or you're failing to meet up to the standards. They're invested in training you and developing you. So it doesn't feel like that. It feels like you're being trained at the level of like a Formula One pit crew or something like that.
What are some of the other ones? And you mentioned one that I think somewhat surprised me is that high performing teams, to get role clarity, their communication patterns are marked by long periods of alone work, solo work, through
Yeah.
research, through deep thinking, but only brief periods or bursts of communication.
Yeah, and I should say, obviously, this is specific to knowledge work teams, right? You know, my wife works in an ER. You can't exactly go away and work alone in that job for long periods of time. But when you look at knowledge workers, office-based workers, remote workers, what have you, what you find is that, and I think I speak for everyone listening when I say we're in like way too many meetings, right? And what you find is those high-performing teams, they're not collaborating better because they're in even more meetings. They're collaborating better because they're actually in fewer but better meetings. They're marked by a sense of bursty communication. So they come together, they run their quick huddle. Here's what we need to be tackling this week. Here's who's doing it. Here's the commitments we're making to each other. Here's the status update on where we are and other things. And then they're preserving that alone time because what actually moves the ball forward is that people need time to think, need time to develop ideas, need time. And it takes time to build an incredible Excel spreadsheet that your team might need to run the numbers for that report, right? And that's time you can't be in a meeting or you can't be constantly distracted by, right? Now, so it doesn't mean they're never communicating and collaborating, but they've kind of mastered that art of coming together to communicate when they need to get themselves in sync, and then also preserving that alone time that people need. And I think that's something that people used to complain about it before the pandemic, that the office was an interruption factory or what have you. And you think we would have solved it when we sent lots of people to work from home, but then all we did was invite them to Zoom meetings every single hour of the day.
Made it worse in some cases, right?
Exactly. We made it worse. No surprise, people are more burned out when they're in this time. Now, obviously, they're more burned out because they're also working during a pandemic. But I think Zoom may be at this point when we're recording this, years into it, I think Zoom might actually be infecting them with a sense of burnout more so than the pandemic itself.
I completely agree with you on that one. The next piece of common understanding, as you mentioned it before, is empathy. Love the analogy you give that it's really you're playing chess, not checkers. Great teams play chess because in checkers, every piece is the same and moves in the same way.
Yeah. Oh man, that's one of my favorite highlights in the book, and very few people ever pull that out. Thank you. Yeah, and I should say I remember hearing this concept or something similar to this from Marcus Buckingham first, I think. But yeah, the idea in checkers, if you ever played checkers, every piece moves the same way, and they all only move forward until you get to the back of the board, and then you can king me, and they move, but they have to stay on the same squares, what have you. In chess, every single piece, or not every single, because I guess there's two rooks and two bishops and two knights, but they all have different patterns to how they move. Not everyone on your team can do every job, and not everyone on your team should do every job. And without that sense of empathy and understanding what people's strengths and weaknesses are, what their preferences are, what have you, you don't get to the ability to see each person as unique and different chess piece that contributes to a greater whole, right? Now, that does mean it comes with more complexity. It's certainly easier to get your head around checkers than it is chess, but it also comes with more opportunity. There are far more ways to win a chess game than there are to win a checkers game.
Wonderful. I agree. And if you have that mentality, it's so much easier to think of each one individually and know who they are and be more effective with dealing with them. And the other piece that really builds empathy, and I had Chester Elton on the podcast not too long ago. He's the guru of gratitude. It's share gratitude because no one gets enough appreciation throughout the day. He even mentioned, he's like, Charles, no one goes home after a day's at work and said, I was just appreciated too much that day. So look for opportunities, simple ways to express your gratitude and share appreciation to your coworkers. It's a great way to develop empathy.
Yeah, yeah, I love Chester. I really do. That's one of my favorite lines of him too. Like, no one ever said my boss just praises me too much, right? But I think the thing that I would add, like, we think about gratitude and we think it's just thank you, right? Just hey, thank you so much for doing this, and that's great. But you actually probably can get too much of that. Not too much of it, but you start to tune it out. I think a really great way to express gratitude and one that increases in empathy is when you kind of have two statements in your message of gratitude. The first is that thank you. Thank you so much for this. The second is kind of impact because it allowed me to do that. Thank you so much for working. So I'm going to use the analogy from before, for working so hard to build that perfect spreadsheet because it allowed me to take those numbers to the client and really nail the presentation and close the business. So the first way is just saying, hey, thank you for this. You were really, really great at it. The second is how my work fit into your work that reinforces that sense of interdependence, that oh, we need to figure that out. The gratitude itself is again another form of really praising somebody in their area of strengths and what have you. But it also kind of, like I said, that second piece really increases the empathy, the understanding, the interdependency that we all have. That only happens if you add that piece. So yeah, I think we need to do a lot more gratitude. But I think in order to keep it from being tuned out, when we're expressing gratitude, whether you're a leader managing a team or whether you're just an individual contributor, we ought to be adding that piece. Here's how it positively impacted me so that people can see you're not in this alone. So you better get to know your people at a new level because you truly are interdependent with them.
And that's important, like you said, is make it specific, make it detailed for them, and praise them on certain behaviors, right? Because it's more meaningful that way than if you just have a blanket statement. Doesn't hold the same level of impact.
Yeah. 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 Chester actually has this great bit too on the specific behaviors where he's like, the most ineffective praise you can go is like, hey, remember that thing you did like a couple weeks ago? Man, that was you rock. That was great. Right. We really can get too much of that. Right. But when somebody has one of those behaviors, I would actually, and sometimes you want to refrain from thanking them in the moment because you know the impact's going to come later. But I would jot it down. And then when you can see the impact, I would make sure to circle back with them. And by the way, if you're leading a team, I would also encourage you to do this to other managers of other teams when they're helping your team succeed too. Because it's not just interdependent on the team that we serve on, the boss that we report to, what have you. We're all interdependent inside of not only our company, but kind of the ecosystem we work in. And so we need to be sending those expressions of gratitude out that way too.
Well, let's move into the second of the three elements. This is the toughest one, hardest to build, psychological safety. We've heard a lot about it. Amy Edmondson's work has been profiled in books and so many programs. Certainly the rarest to build because it involves totally rethinking how leaders and teams respond to divergent ideas and mistakes. So we'll go through each one of the kind of the components of it, but give us your overview of this concept and really how it pertains to high performing teams or the key maybe characteristics.
Yeah, yeah. Hardest to build and easiest to destroy, right? But yeah. So to use, I love Edmondson's definition. I think it's great. It's quite simply that psychological safety happens on a team when people feel the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking, right? Interpersonal risk taking is an interesting phrase. What does that mean? Well, when I speak up because I disagree, I'm taking an interpersonal risk. I'm taking the risk of looking like suddenly an outsider, not a member of the team. When I share a kind of a crazy idea, something outside of the box, I'm taking an interpersonal risk because I might get judged for being too crazy, too far outside of the box. When I admit that I failed, or when I say, hey, I screwed up here, I'm taking an interpersonal risk that I'm going to be punished or kind of abused or stepped over for that. Right. And so psychological safety is how well on a team we feel like we can build that. It's a mix. It's a climate that's marked by trust and respect, and those are two different things we'll break down in turn. But I'll give you an idea of the impact of psychological safety. My favorite story, probably because it's one of my favorite humans. My nomination for greatest living CEO is Alan Mulally and the turnaround of Ford from 2006 to about 8 years later, which included the financial crisis, but started before that. The culture, Ford was set to lose $17 billion if they operated at plan, right? So they literally told their investors, here's the plan, and we're going to lose $17 billion on it, but stick with us. They were set to lose that much money when Alan Mulally took over. And one of the primary reasons for that, they didn't have innovative thinking, right? They had way too much silos and politics and turf wars and what have you. But the biggest thing they lacked in their senior leadership team and on down was this sense of psychological safety. People felt like if you showed a kink in your armor, someone was going to stab you in it because people were constantly trying to claw over each other. Competition for a lot of executives was internal competition for the next promotion was more on their radar than the competition of other automakers and what have you. And what Alan decided to do is, I'm going to turn that around. We're going to change this culture. One of the things he would be, he's sort of this Kansas farm boy character, even now, as you know, he's turning around a multi-billion-dollar company. One of the things we'd always say is like, hey, I get it. It's nice to be important, but it's more important to be nice. right? We as a team are going to commit to not judging people's ideas too quickly, not shooting them down, to respecting when people are failing, what have you. And this takes time and it takes some tough decisions. He'll tell you there was an executive on his team. There's about a 17-person senior leadership team. And there was an executive on his team that just couldn't do it. That constantly was like making jokes at other people's expenses and taking advantage of people's flaws or admissions of failure. And he came to him one day and said, "Look, you're acting this way and it's against the way we've decided to do as a team. So you have a decision to make about whether or not you want to change. And I want you to know whatever you decide, it's okay." Which is, again, this sort of Kansas farm boy, Alan Mulally. And the executive goes, "What do you mean it's okay? Like if I don't want to change, it's okay?" No, 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 no. If you don't want to change, you can't be a member of this team. But I want you to know I love you. I'll support you. I'll help you find a new job somewhere else, but you can't stay in this role, or you can decide to change and that's also okay. Right? So I love that idea. Whatever you do, it's okay. You just can't keep doing this here. Now it took time. It took a lot of time to develop that trust. In fact, one of the things I did was a regular weekly meeting, kind of on the clarity piece, if you really think about it, to get the team together and share where are we, what are we achieving, what are we lacking, what have you. And he asked the executives to color code their slides. There's 320 different metrics that it takes to track the performance of a company like Ford. And he wanted each metric color coded: red, yellow, green. Exactly how they think. Red would be we have a huge problem. Yellow would be, we got a problem. We're off track. We're just updating you on it, but we'll get back on track. And green is everything's normal. And for 8 weeks, all 320 slides were green every week in every meeting. It wasn't until week 9 that one slide got changed to red. And it wasn't even necessarily intentional. It was because it was undeniable. Mark Fields was the executive in charge of the launch of the Ford Edge. There were production problems and they were going to have to delay the launch, which is something you get to a point where you can't hide that anymore. And he couldn't. So he had to turn his slide red. But eventually there's that moment where he has to go first, where Mark Field has to go first and share it. And that's the real moment. This is why I say it's a mix of trust and respect. Not just me, I actually Amy Edmondson too, but that it's a mix of trust and respect. Because I don't know that Mark actually really trusted everybody, but he was willing to take the risk because it was undeniable. And in that moment, in the old company, pre-Mulally, Mark would have been ejected. Mark would have been fired. When he presented his slide, there was dead silence. Everybody was staring at Mark, staring
They
at
figured
Alan.
he was done.
Right. Alan actually told me he thought people were waiting for him to like hit a button under the desk and two big guys in suits were going to come escort Mark out. But that's not what Alan did. Instead, he started clapping. He said, "Mark, this is great visibility. Okay, let's put our heads together. How can we solve this problem?" He met that risk with respect, right? That your admission of failure is an opportunity for us to grow. And I'm going to honor that, hold space for it, and help you solve that problem. And the next week, truthfully, not much changed because people still thought that was the last we're ever going to see Mark. But when they came to that meeting, this is week 10 now, right? 1 week after Mark's red slide, they found that Mark hadn't been fired. Mark was actually moved. His new position, he was seated at the right hand of Alan Mulally, right? So people were like, did he get promoted? What just happened here? And it was that moment. Alan actually told me it was that moment when people walked in the room and saw that Mark was still there that they began to trust. Right? So think about this cycle: trust, risk, respect. That's why it takes forever to build and one moment or one day to destroy, because it's this constant cycle of people taking that interpersonal risk because they trust you, but you having to match that with respect, with honor, with listening to that crazy idea, even if you disagree with it, and helping somebody think through it, to take that failure and help somebody extract a lesson from it. You have to do that every time, match respect with that trust in order to grow the level of psychological safety on the team. And by the way, the story has a happy ending. Alan resigned almost a decade later as CEO. The company had turned around. The financial crisis didn't even slow them down. And they ended up posting a $7 billion profit the year that he resigned. He showed the board a $7 billion profit on the 10K when he announced his resignation. And he gave them one other thing. Gave them a recommendation for who should be the new CEO after him. Do you know who he recommended? Mark Fields.
Thanks, David, for a great story. That's one of my favorite leaders. Great book, American Icon, that kind of profiles Alan Mulally. And what he did that really made it stand out for me was he signaled vulnerability. And it's not a sign of weakness because he came from Boeing. He had no experience in the auto industry. He didn't claim he was competent in something that he wasn't. He put boundaries around his competence. He had very high levels confidence in what he was doing because he knew he could turn it around and the same philosophy would work at Ford that it did at Boeing. But he didn't signal to others that he knew more than what he actually did. And that vulnerability is key. It's not a sign of weakness, right? It's a sign of trust. And to celebrate failures, another great way to establish that trust and that psychological safety within teams.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this is the Mark Fields example, right? And then when I say celebrate failure, I mean you don't have to throw a party because the delay of the Edge is going to be launched, but in every failure there is a lesson, right? There is something we can learn to do to prevent ourselves from failing next time, something we can learn about how to respond to a failure. I mean, failures come in a variety of forms. They're always inevitable, but sometimes they're because of our own competence or incompetence, and sometimes because they're because of external factors that we just didn't see. But every time they come with that lesson. Failure is inevitable, learning is a choice. And the thing that Alan demonstrated in that moment was, we're going to solve this. What can we do for him? How can we learn from this? What systems are we going to put in place? And when you do, what you celebrate is the transparency to admit one's role in the failure so we can extract those lessons. That's worth throwing a party over. You don't necessarily have to, but what you do have to do is show that I'm not going to take advantage of this, right? I'm a huge fan of the way Gary Ridge kind of encouraged everybody at WD-40 to reframe failures as learning moments. You couldn't use the F word there. I mean, you couldn't use either F word there, but you had to rephrase it. It was, I had a learning moment. Here's what I learned. And failure's kind of built into that company anyway. I mean, it's called WD-40 because it was the 40th attempt at a water displacement formula before it finally worked, right? So you better be learning from each one of those.
The other thing with the respect piece, I just want to go through that respect can be a learned behavior, right? And the number one reason you say, well, for organizations to have this disrespectful behavior is because people are just modeling the behavior they see within the organization. But to have more respect, right? It starts at the top and it really is modeled through active listening.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so respect is leaders model the way here. Respect is learned behavior. The research you just quoted comes from Christine Porath, who's probably the world's most respected researcher on respect in the workplace. One of the things I ask often when I'm working directly with a leader, one of the questions to gauge psychological safety that I ask all the time is, when was the last time someone on your team disagreed with you publicly? And then how did you act? Right? Because people are going to mimic how you act. And that's what makes that skill of active listening so important, right? If you just jump in the first time they take a breath and tell them why their idea will never work, right? Or you just sort of start to berate them for the failure before they've even explained the whole situation, people will mimic that. But active listening, in other words, if you're tuned into what they're saying, if you're I use the acronym from Julian Treasure, RASA: receive, appreciate, summarize, ask. If you're really receiving and just focused on hearing them until they're done speaking, right? If you're showing appreciation for what they're saying, those little nonverbals, the nods of the head, the eye contact, the ums and ahs, all of those show that you are in it, that you really appreciate what they're saying. Before you say anything, if you can summarize what you heard them say, which not only helps them feel heard, it gives you a chance to check for understanding before you respond. And then when you do respond, if you before you give your take, can ask those kind of clarifying questions that help them get at it, you can not only treat them with respect in that moment, but you can probably understand what's actually happening, understand the problem, the failure they're coming to you, and better extract the lesson. So to me, active listening is not just important for demonstrating respect and modeling that way. I think it's also important because a lot of times, especially if you're higher up in an organization, when people come to you with a problem or an admission of failure, they're taking a risk, but they're not risking as much as you think. They're not actually coming to you with the full problem. They're coming to you with the problem they trust sharing in front of you. And there may be other information they're holding from you. There may be other situations. They may just be telling you a symptom of the deeper problem because they don't know what your reaction is going to be yet. When you model active listening, when you receive, appreciate, when you summarize, when you ask those clarifying questions, you have a better shot at getting at the actual problem you need to be responding to begin with.
Some great insights there with trust and respect and how that really builds psychological safety. And it's a great end to Alan's story because, like what I know from the press, what happened afterward is the one that came forward with that different color was the one that he nominated, right, in the end.
Yep, and I should be fair, right? Fast forward like 10 years from when that story concluded, Ford's not doing as well as they were under Alan Mulally, right? Which again shows you that idea. Hardest to to build, easiest to destroy. As soon as you let kind of some of the old guard, old mentality people run the show, not saying it was Mark, but I'm saying it's been 10 years. And so, the changes to culture Alan made had a lot of time to change back. And that's how ephemeral psychological safety can be, right? It can be here today, gone tomorrow if we don't act with respect when people take those risks. We can end up degrading it and end up in a similar or worse situation than we were when it began.
Well, and that's why too that it's just such a topic of conversation for building high performing teams because it's the hardest to keep going and establishing initially. So it's very ephemeral, like you said. Let's move that to the third and final piece, and that's the pro-social purpose. Give us a definition of that, and I love the story of KPMG that you put in the book that really kind of demonstrates this.
Oh, thank you. No, it's one of my favorite stories too, and probably my favorite. I mean, these three elements are kind of like kids. You're not supposed to have a favorite, but this is probably my favorite to talk about. So pro-social purpose is what happens when team members feel they're making a meaningful contribution toward work that benefits others. Two different elements in there, if you will: meaning and contribution, which is about seeing how my work actually helps, actually is important. In organizational psychology lingo, we call this task significance, right? That what I do matters because it affects what other people in the org do or the customer, what have you. And then the second element towards work that impacts others, it leverages what we might call pro-social motivation, the impact we see on other people, right? And it turns out both of those are hugely important, not only for individual motivation, but for a team as well. When we have this sense of pro-social purpose, we're more likely, I'm gonna get super nerdy here for a second, we're more likely to exhibit what are referred to as organizational citizenship behaviors, the little behaviors that provide help to the team, that put we over me, as I like to say, that signal that the team and its needs are more important in the moment than my individual needs. I see this impact directly on motivation and engagement and what have you in KPMG, right? So KPMG, under the leadership of Bruce Fowl, when he was their chief human resources officer, was really struggling with increasing their employee engagement. They had tried a few things. When Fowl took over several years before they launched the initiative I'm about to tell you about, they had done a couple things to kind of move the needle on engagement, increasing flexibility, perks, pay increases, what have you. But it didn't go all that much. And so Fowl was looking at the results of the most recent engagement survey. This was around 2014 when he was kind of at a loss for what else to do. And he's examining the results of the survey and he notices how abysmal the responses are to the question, I feel that the work that I do makes an impact. And he thought, that's weird because we really do make an impact. Maybe they just don't see it. Right. And so they started this kind of twofold approach. The first is, I sometimes call it a corporate propaganda campaign. It's maybe something you've seen before. They called it the We Shape History campaign. And what they did was they basically prepared these stories and videos and posters and things like that for people to see how the work KPMG had done in the past was impactful in the world. And then, so by extension, the work that you're doing is impactful because you're part of us. And so they would tell these stories like how KPMG managed the logistics of the Lend-Lease Act, which is how the United States entered World War II and eventually won it for the Allies, right? Or they told the story about how KPMG was the firm that certified the election results in 1994 in South Africa. So Nelson Mandela, first Black president of South Africa, KPMG was there to certify it. KPMG was involved in the cleanup and recovery efforts and the insurance contracts and the logistics after the tragedy of 9/11, right? So helping the nation heal. These are all things we're involved in. And so you are too. And that was great. Like it was fun. People got impactful. People hung the posters in their cubicles and what have you. But it was what they did after that was really impactful. They launched what they called the 10,000 Stories Challenge. And in essence, what they said was, you've heard how we've made a difference in the past. You tell us how you're making a difference right now. Right. So who are you impacting right away? Now, at the time, there was about 30,000 employees in the firm. So 10,000, good number. We might get a third of responses. But here's the goal, right? Maybe in 6 months after we announce this, we can get to 10,000 stories. 4 months in, they cut it short because they got 42,000 stories. My favorite was yeah, right? My favorite was they created this app. So you had these posters that were professionally designed, and then they created an app where you could input your own answer and choose from some stock imagery and make your own personal poster of how you make an impact at KPMG. And these are hyper personal answers. Like one was, I help farmers grow because I'm auditing several banks in the farm credit system that keeps family farms in business, right? Or I restore neighborhoods because I work with community development groups that revitalize low income communities, right? 42 different and specific answers to this question, who is served by the work that we're due, which is the ultimate way to get at this sense of pro social purpose is, can you as a team answer that question? Now, most of us know where this story is going, right? Increases in engagement, increases in motivation, increases in performance, et cetera. What I think is interesting is when they did the next engagement survey after these 42,000 stories, they broke the questions down by how well the team had participated in the 10,000 stories challenge. And this is where the huge differences became apparent. So you had close to 80% of people saying that I'm proud to work at KPMG, only about 40% in the we don't talk about purpose group, right? You had, I feel that the work that I do makes an impact. 30% more people responded positively if they took it seriously, if they were in the pro social purpose group. My favorite, one of the questions in the survey is, I rarely think about looking for a new job, right? Close to 80% of people said, yeah, in the purpose group said, yeah, I rarely think about looking for a new job. Only about 25% in the non purpose. In other words, 70% of the people who didn't engage in this story are looking for a new job, right? And I think that signals really kind of the impact of pro social purpose. When people know their work is important and that it impacts specific people, they're making a contribution towards work that impacts others. They're more motivated, they're more engaged with their team. And yeah, they're less likely to look for a new job as well because they're getting the meaning they want from work from that job. People, in the end, like Charles, I can summarize everything we've talked about today in one sentence. People want to do work that matters, and they want to work for leaders who tell them they matter. And yeah, that starts with pro social purpose, but you could see how building psychological safety and building clarity and empathy towards common understanding, all of those things contribute to that idea that the work that we're doing as a team matters, and you as an individual matter because you're a member of this team, and we couldn't do it without you.
Well, and the gold in that story for me really is them being able to take it from a organizational level to get it down to that individual level. So everyone saw the difference they were making. That is so critical. Not many organizations can get that level of engagement and buy-in and commitment of people seeing, okay, here's how I'm impacting the greater whole, and here's what I'm doing on an individual level that's really making me feel good, right? So important to do because I think a lot of organizations they have metrics, but the metrics really kind of blur what really matters. Another tool that you give in the book that I love, it's if you want to make it more meaningful, is it's a wonderful life test,
Yeah.
which is kind of it might be a little cheesy, and it's from the old uh, famous holiday movie, but it's having a team try to imagine how the world would be different if your organization did not exist, just for them to see the impact that it's having, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's either cheesy or morbid depending on your take, right? But the idea "It's a Wonderful Life" is where the angel Clarence, worst name for an angel ever, by the way, Clarence, like Michael and Gabriel Clarence. Um, but where essentially Clarence shows George what the world would look like if he didn't exist. And I encourage, not even at the organization level, the team level, to do that same activity, right? Maybe don't get morbid and we all die in this, but just like, hey, if we all disappeared tomorrow, if we got Thanos snapped, or if we all took a vacation
Right.
for a month and our flight got delayed and we were stuck because of a volcano over Iceland and the company had to go 3 weeks without us, what would happen? Right. And then the impact that your team makes is usually behind the impact that your absence would make. So it's a really strong indicator into how important your contribution is by running this thought experiment of, if we weren't making that contribution, what would happen? Yes, it kind of focuses on the negative, but the positive comes afterwards when you realize we're still here. And so we're still able to do that and make that impact.
And fostering a culture that really collects these impact stories. I love the Savannah Bananas. I think a lot of people have heard about them now. But what a great story that kind of turns the model on its head of minor league baseball and taking this brand new approach to it that has impact, that's engaging, and that also produces a winning culture.
Yeah, yeah. Not minor league, by the way, college summer league, right? So in minors, you've got like minor, triple A, double A, single A, rookie league. And then way underneath, you've got college summer leagues like the Coastal Plain League, which is where they started, right? So they were essentially farming a team of people that were college students on summer break. You weren't allowed to pay them. You could pay food and put them in lodging and what have you, but weren't allowed to officially pay them. I guess now you can pay them because of the changes in name and likeness and what have you, but only for that. Um, and the average, this I think is crazy. In the Coastal Plain League, the average ticket sales were 200 tickets per game. Johnson Stadium, where the Savannah Bananas play, seats 4,000 people. So imagine like your first game, 4,000 stadium, 200 people. Kind of hard to feel like you're making an impact when you're staring at that many empty seats, right? But they're incredibly committed to fans first, right? So they do a couple other things to change right away. I mean, they do if you've been to any of their games, which I highly recommend, but if you've been to a lot of sporting events now, you see during the intermissions and breaks and whatever, they're trying to do crazy stuff. But they take it to a whole other level in the way they interact with fans on a regular basis. So if you show up to the game, the first thing you're gonna do is walk through a sort of a parade that's led by the team. So you're going to interact with the players right off the bat. You're going to kind of, and they're all going to say, thank you for coming out today. Right. And then they're going to play, they're going to interact with the fans. One of the things they do in their exhibition games, I think this is great. One of their rules is if there's a foul ball and it's caught by a fan, it's still an out, right? So engaging people in the team. Obviously, it didn't work in official games, but in exhibition games, it's a fun little rule they add onto their stadium. And the thing I think, so they do all of these kind of crazy things and ways they entertain the fans. And I could go, I mean, there's a whole business case study about customer experience there. I kind of wanted to talk about them in this book because of the way that when they do all those things, they also capture them and share them internally too. So, we were talking about gratitude on a regular basis. Thank you so much for this because it allowed me to do that. They're sharing those fan first stories on a regular basis. When they find out, even if it's not a player, even if it's a staff member, hot dog vendor, whatever it is, they're sharing those stories on a regular basis. And it gets back to the players. And you can actually see it in the data. The players play harder as well. So much so that the last time they won the Coastal Plague League championship, before they left the league, and now they just do exhibition games, the owner, Jesse Cole, you do that normal. We all have these. Every sports movie has the locker room speech, the big motivational. Here's we're going to win it, and what have you. They didn't do that. Instead, they went back and they interviewed a lot of fans and season ticket holders and people who'd been impacted by their work, and they just asked them each to submit like a 60-second video. And Jesse came as the owner to give the big motivational speech, and he didn't do that. He just pushed play on the DVD and just let people see story after story. And by the way, they won the championship.
Well, and they do so many things that are counterintuitive. I mean, not only are they building the best team ever, building a winning culture, right? I mean, they have what 150 games of being sold out, so it's really hard to get tickets now. But it's such a great example and a model of what you can build if you're willing to break some of those rules and follow some of these principles that you've identified in your latest book. Before we end today's interview, just is there one thing that a leader could do to start? I mean, is there one of those three components that they should start with, or one thing that maybe they could start with in building better teams within their organization?
Yeah, I think this is hard because the three elements sort of are interchange. They're not interchangeable, but they interact, right? They kind of have to be developed alongside each other. But I'll say this: you probably already, as we're talking about each of the three, have an idea of where you might lack as a leader. Hey, you know what? I don't express gratitude enough. Maybe I'm not vulnerable with my team enough. Maybe I don't collect those impact stories enough. So rather than say, like, here, if there's one thing you do this, I'm going to say this. You're listening this far. I mean, you just listened to, we're at this for like 40 minutes. You just listened to a lot of different stuff. I bet you there's something tugging on you that you're like, I could do this again. I would do that. I would start there, where it is. Obviously, I hope you grab a copy of the book. I hope that's the first thing you do. But truthfully, just start whatever you were like, yeah, I really need to do more of that. Go with that one. Right after, by the way, you leave a review for the show and you go to ims-online.com to check out all of our awesome programs.
Wonderful. I love the plug, David. Thank you for joining me again on the podcast. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Yeah, I'm really blessed here, Charles. I have a really unique name, David Burkus. There's not a lot of us in the world. There's actually only two that are on the internet, and I'm like 20 years older than the other one. So if you type that into Google, you're gonna find me. So whatever social you want to find and converse with, I hope you find me there. Website's there with a lot more resources. It's davidburkus.com. But connect with me wherever is comfortable for you, because this is a conversation that's not going to end today, right? And if I can be of service to you as you're listening to this and how you can implement this with your team, please feel free to reach out on whatever network you're comfortable with.
If you like this episode, then please share it on social media and consider leaving a review or rating. If there are specific leadership topics or industry leaders you'd like us to feature on the podcast, we are welcome to your suggestions. Remember, knowledge's transformative power is only activated when it is acted upon. So what actions are you going to take on the insights and knowledge shared in this episode?